They were called brides of Christ, cloistered away to live lives of purity and prayer. To families and the faithful, convent walls promised protection, honor, and holiness. But behind those same walls, a different reality often unfolded. Accused nuns, whether guilty or not, faced punishments that stripped them of dignity, freedom, and even identity. The very symbols of devotion, from the veil to the silence of prayer, could be turned against them as tools of control. Their stories remind us that sanctity and suffering lived side by side. What they endured was not just discipline, it was a battle for their very humanity. In the medieval imagination, the convent stood as a safe haven, a place where women lived apart from the world in prayer, silence, and purity. Families and church leaders believed that behind cloister walls, nuns dedicated every breath to God, free from temptation or worldly concerns. The veil was seen as a mark of honor, and the life of a nun was praised as one of the highest forms of devotion. Yet the records of history tell us that this vision was never the full truth. While many women lived faithfully according to their vows, some were accused of breaking the strict rules that governed their lives. A vow of chastity could be violated by secret relationships, a vow of silence broken by whispers and complaints, and the vow of obedience challenged by rebellion or refusal. Once such accusations were made, the convent was no longer a place of safety for the accused. It became a site of judgment and discipline, where errors, whether proven or only suspected, were answered not with gentle correction but with punishment. And those punishments were not always seen or known by the outside world. But what happened next wasn't confession or forgiveness. It was punishment, and often punishment hidden from public eyes. From the earliest centuries of Christian monastic life, strict rulebooks guided the daily routines of nuns. One of the most influential came from Caesarius of Arles in the 6th century, known as the Regula Virginum. This text left little to chance. Nuns were instructed to rise before dawn for prayer, to wear simple and modest clothing, to avoid idle talk, and to eat sparingly. Even gestures and movements were expected to reflect humility and discipline. The purpose of such regulation was clear: to protect women from temptation, to guard their chastity, and to keep both body and soul under constant control. The enclosure of the convent was not only about physical walls but also about creating a spiritual barrier against the outside world. By following these rules, nuns were supposed to embody purity itself, shining as examples of holy life. Yet strict order came with its own pressures, and the human spirit did not always conform to rigid boundaries. But as history shows, when rules tighten too much, resistance always begins to show. In 1298, Pope Boniface VIII issued a decree that would shape convent life for centuries. The document, known as Periculoso, demanded that all nuns remain perpetually enclosed within their convent walls. Its language was firm and unyielding, warning that women vowed to God must be shielded from occasions of sin and that their chastity had to be safeguarded at all costs. The decree stressed that enclosure was necessary to preserve nunnish modesty, and to prevent scandal from spreading beyond the cloister. Such strong wording reveals something deeper: the fear that misconduct and rumors were already troubling religious houses. If vows of purity were being questioned, then tighter control seemed to church leaders the only answer. What had once been a voluntary retreat into holy life was now reinforced by strict legal obligation. Nuns were no longer simply choosing seclusion, they were commanded to it. And this shift carried a heavy consequence. If cloister walls were meant to protect, they soon doubled as prisons. In the 12th century, one of the most striking stories of broken vows came from Wotton Priory in Yorkshire. A young nun, still early in her religious life, entered into a relationship with a lay brother connected to the community. According to the chronicler Ellard of Rievaulx, the affair soon led to pregnancy, a shocking violation of the vow of chastity. The priory reacted with swift punishment. The nun was imprisoned and subjected to humiliation, while her lover was beaten and forced to flee. Yet Ellard's account does not present the story as mere failure. He reframed the scandal as a miracle, describing how the nun was eventually forgiven and restored, her pregnancy mysteriously disappearing. For him, It was evidence of divine mercy at work within the convent walls. But even in this retelling, the harsh discipline and the desperation of escape reveal the deep conflict between the strict ideals of monastic life and the natural desires of those who lived within it. This was not the last time convent walls heard cries of scandal. It was only the beginning. In the early 16th century, Littlemore Priory in Oxfordshire became the stage for one of the most notorious convent scandals in England. During an official church visitation in 1517, investigators uncovered a long list of violations. The prioress, Catherine Wells, was accused of having a child with a convent chaplain, a direct breach of her vow of chastity. Beyond this, she was also charged with using convent funds to provide a dowry for her daughter, diverting money meant for the community. The investigation did not stop with the prioress. Other nuns at Littlemore were found to be openly disobedient, refusing discipline and rebelling against authority. Punishments were harsh. Some were locked in stocks within the convent itself, a humiliating form of correction meant to break their will. One nun, desperate to escape, reportedly burned her way out of confinement. Another declared openly that she was ashamed to live under what she called the evil rule of her superior. These were not whispered accusations or rumors. They were official findings, written into formal visitation records that survive to this day. Littlemore Priory revealed not only human weakness but also the extreme measures of punishment used to enforce obedience. But what happened in some convents went even further than scandal. It touched the shadows of imprisonment. Punishment inside convents did not always take the form of public shame. More often, discipline was carried out quietly, away from outside eyes. Records and accounts suggest that nuns accused of disobedience could be shut away in isolation, sometimes in small locked rooms meant only for correction. Silence itself was used as a weapon. Offenders were forbidden to speak, cut off from the community that gave their lives meaning. In other cases, food was withheld as a form of penance, forcing the body into submission when words of rebuke seemed insufficient. These punishments were rarely recorded in detail, because they belonged to the internal justice of the convent, where superiors decided what response was necessary and outsiders seldom questioned it. To the world beyond the cloister, the convent might still appear a place of harmony and devotion. Inside, however, these hidden systems of discipline shaped daily life for those accused of failing in their vows. And sometimes the silence was so complete that women simply vanished. In 1304, the royal justice rolls recorded a strange entry from the Benedictine priory of Clementhorpe in Yorkshire. A nun named Cecilia was listed as having been removed during the night, along with certain goods. The record does not name her captors, nor does it explain why she was taken. Just 2 years later, in 1306, a similar note appears from the Cistercian convent at Kirklees. There, a woman named Elizabeth de Hopton was also seized under unclear circumstances. Again, the official wording is brief and offers no answers. Were these women kidnapped from outside forces, perhaps for ransom or personal motives? Or were they being forced out as part of secret disciplinary measures within the convent walls? The lack of detail leaves modern historians with more questions than certainty. What is clear is that such disappearances were recorded not as elopements or voluntary departures, but as removals, suggesting that the women had little choice in the matter. Their fate was left unspoken in the surviving documents, creating a silence as unsettling as the act itself. Were they escaping injustice, or being punished within? The answer lies in darker stories yet to come. In the 19th century, the idea of hidden convent punishments reached a sensational peak with the publication of Awful Disclosures in 1836. Written by Maria Monk, the book claimed that Canadian convents contained underground dungeons where nuns were locked away, silenced, and abused in secret. The stories were shocking and gripped the public imagination, fueling strong waves of anti-Catholic feeling across North America. Yet historians quickly exposed the book as unreliable, filled with exaggeration and invention. Even so, its popularity reveals something important. People were already inclined to believe that convent walls hid terrible secrets. While Monk's descriptions of dungeons were mostly fiction, there is evidence that some convents did have private chambers used for discipline. These spaces were not the vast underground prisons she described, but small rooms where silence and seclusion could be enforced. The myth of the convent dungeon may have gone beyond reality, but it echoed a long-standing fear that convents could punish in ways outsiders would never see. And the truth is that confinement was not the only form of discipline. But punishment was not only about walls and chains, it could be written across the body itself. In the medieval world, a woman's hair carried deep meaning. It was more than appearance. It was tied to dignity, honor, and even chastity. For this reason, hair became a powerful tool in both religious ritual and punishment. When a woman entered the convent, her hair might be cut in a symbolic act of devotion, showing her renunciation of vanity and her dedication to God. This ceremonial tonsure was considered holy, a crown of humility. Yet the same act, when carried out in a different spirit, could be used as a weapon of shame. Legal and ecclesiastical records suggest that nuns accused of sexual misconduct or disobedience were sometimes punished through forced hair shearing. In these cases, the blade stripped not only hair but also status. What was sacred in one context became disgrace in another. A woman who had once been honored as a bride of Christ could be marked publicly as fallen and dishonored. The gesture was simple, but its meaning cut deep, turning a sign of sanctity into a scar of humiliation. And once hair fell on the cold stone floor, another layer of identity was gone. Throughout convent life, the line between sanctity and suppression was often thin. The very rituals that were meant to honor devotion could also be turned into punishments. The veil, which marked a woman as dedicated to God, could become a symbol of confinement when she was forbidden to step beyond the cloister. The tonsure, a gesture of humility, could just as easily be forced upon a nun to disgrace her. Even silence, prized as a spiritual practice, became a means of control when used to isolate and silence dissenting voices. These practices were not invented as punishments, yet in the hands of authority they could be reshaped to enforce discipline and obedience. For some women, the same symbols that once promised holiness became reminders of power exercised over their bodies and their lives. The convent was therefore both sanctuary and cage, a place of prayer and a place of correction. But what did all this mean for women whose only choice was between obedience or erasure? Across the centuries, convents were remembered as spaces of prayer, silence, and devotion. Yet the evidence left behind in chronicles, church decrees, and visitation records shows a more complicated truth. They were also places of control, where vows were guarded by strict rules and punishments. When those vows were broken, or even suspected of being broken, the response often blurred the line between spiritual correction and coercion. Isolation, silence, confinement, or forced humiliation all reveal how discipline could overshadow devotion. For many nuns, life in the cloister was sincere and peaceful, but for others, accusation meant their bodies and choices were no longer their own. The symbols of faith, from the veil to the shears, could shift from holy to hostile in a single moment, depending on who wielded authority. That tension leaves us with a lasting question. Were convents truly sanctuaries of God, or were they cages built to contain women under the weight of obedience? The stories suggest they were both, depending on where one stood within the walls. When vows became weapons, devotion itself could turn into a cage.